This is Whiskey Lore. A trade circular issued to Mr. John D. Hounahan of Buffalo, New York, lately came into the Cincinnati Enquirer's hands. It's not exactly adapted for general circulation and belongs to that class of literature which the recipients are supposed to keep under lock and key, not because of any indelicate allusions to the anatomy of the human frame, but because Mr. Hounahan assumes that he's addressing liquor dealers alone and hence makes no bones about mentioning the passwords, signs, grips, and secret work generally of the sample room neighborhood. He says, quote, "I have written a book on the process of making whiskey, brandy, gin, ale, porter, lager beer, and everything pertaining to the business. The recipes are so simple that a boy 10 years old can make in your cellar or back room 20 gallons of bourbon whiskey inside of an hour, and you may place it side by side with the genuine. You can't tell the difference. My directions for imitating bourbon whiskey, Irish whiskey, and French brandy are the best in existence. You may put my imitations and the genuine side by side, and the taste judge will pronounce them the same. Besides, they can be made to present the appearance of being 20 years old. It's a fact known to many great liquor dealers that half of the whiskey sold in this country never passed through a still, for it's nearly all adulterated more or less. As a reference, I could mention many of the first hotel bars of Maryland and Pennsylvania now using my book as a guide. But considering the nature of the book, I won't mention any names. This precious book is not a bad-looking little volume and talks out in meeting on the title page in this style. As old whiskey barrels are more valuable than those that come from the cooper's hands, some enterprising citizen may go into the business of instantly metamorphosizing young and lusty casks into hoary patriarchs. To do this, dissolve in 3 gallons of water 3 pounds of sulfuric acid and 1 pound of sulfate of iron. Wash your barrel with this mixture on the outside, and in a few hours, you'll have it as rusty and venerable as though they'd lain in a warehouse for 40 years. Now, this description of passing off a new barrel as old was devious enough, but it paled in comparison to what was going on inside a number of late 19th century whiskey barrels. And this June 1895 syndicated article titled "What is Drank" must have come as quite a shock to some. The collective wisdom of the era suggested that rectified whiskey was purified spirit that was distilled and freed from impurities. To hear the cavalier attitude of this concoctor of poisonous spirits probably had more than a few eyeballs looking with a mix of fear and disgust at the tainted dram in their hands. But as whiskey legends have told us, this era of rectified whiskey rabble was about to meet its match in the man in a shiny black top hat, gray beard, and rimless spectacles, and his whiskey legislation that would soon put them out of business. Well, let me introduce you to Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr., a Kentucky distiller, former banker, and former mayor of Frankfort, Kentucky, as well as a descendant of both President James Madison and old rough-and-ready President Zachary Taylor. Known for his work with W.A. Gaines, the maker of Old Crow, his partnership with George T. Stagg and the ownership of OFC Distillery, later known as Buffalo Trace, and his development of the castle-like Old Taylor Distillery, today known as Castle & Key, Taylor was a master at promoting and marketing his bourbons. And having put in the time, money, and effort that was required in the 19th century to promote and market these products, the idea of having unscrupulous rectifiers undoing all of his good works, he had to find a way to keep his customers' confidence by differentiating his products from all the riffraff. So as the story goes, he joined with the former presidential hopeful and current Secretary of State, John G. Carlisle, and they began to lobby Congress. The goal was to get a set of legal regulations that would allow distillers to create pure whiskey under a protective set of bottling, production, and advertising rules. They were eyeing the practice of government bonding, a system that had been available to them for years. But it had very loose guidelines for product quality and labeling. They hoped to propose something that would guarantee the quality of any product that followed the guidelines. The legislation would be called the Bottled in Bond Act. In it, what was bottled had to be produced by the same distiller at the same distillery during the same distilling season, aged for at least 4 years, unadulterated with anything other than water for proofing, and bottled at exactly 100 proof, or 50% alcohol, and all under government supervision, including the use of government-bonded warehouses. In addition, the label had to identify the distillery where the whiskey was distilled and where it was bottled, and it required a green wrap stamp over the cork. In Taylor's eyes, those that took advantage of it would have all the proof they needed to show they had the purest product available on the market. It's a great story, but is it true? Now, in central Kentucky, the story of the Bottled in Bond Act in 1897 and the part that Colonel E.H. Taylor played in it is legendary. There are a few distilleries that ignore telling the tale, especially the ones that Taylor had involvement in, including Buffalo Trace and Castle and Key. Go to the Buffalo Trace website, and E.H. Taylor is called, quote, the founding father of the modern bourbon industry, unquote. It mentions his fight for the passage of the Bottled in Bond Act and the promotion of modern techniques. Now, the Castle and Key website's a little more laid back, more focusing on the Scottish castle-inspired distillery that he built. But this story's gone well beyond central Kentucky. It's basically part of the historical legacy of bourbon whiskey itself. I decided that it was time to go seek out all the different variations of the story available on the web. I asked Google's Gemini AI, who wrote the Bottled in Bond Act? Its answer was quite emphatic. The Bottled in Bond Act of 1897 was primarily championed and pushed through Congress by Colonel Edmund H. Taylor, Jr., along with crucial advocacy from Colonel James E. Pepper and Secretary of the Treasury John G. Carlisle. It goes on to say that it was enacted to combat rampant adulteration in the whiskey industry. Its main purpose was to guarantee the quality, purity, and age of whiskey by having it bottled under government supervision. Taylor was considered the driving force behind the legislation, aiming to protect the integrity of straight whiskey. The legislation was passed by the U.S. federal government on March 3, 1897. It was a response to unregulated rectifiers who often added dangerous substances to whiskey. Now, that answer should have made me pretty happy because when I came back after my first trip to Kentucky distilleries, I was filled with this spirit of enthusiasm for telling the story of E.H. Taylor, and I basically told a very similar story to what Google Gemini AI just told us. But I can't just look at one resource, I have to look at another. So I decided to ask Grok AI, did Colonel E.H. Taylor write the Bottled in Bond Act? No, Colonel E.H. Taylor did not write the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897. It was a federal law and not a document personally authored by any one individual outside of the congressional process. However, Taylor, often called the father of modern bourbon, played a major role in advocating for it. In the late 19th century, the whiskey industry faced rampant adulteration, in other words, rectifiers adding harmful substances like iodine or even formaldehyde to cheap spirits, which harmed consumers and honest distillers. Taylor, along with other straight whiskey producers like Colonel James E. Pepper, lobbied tirelessly for stricter standards and consumer protections. He was instrumental in pushing for the bill's passage, collaborating with figures such as Treasury Secretary John G. Carlisle and lawmakers to champion higher quality and integrity in bourbon production. This advocacy helped make the Bottled in Bond Act the United States' first major consumer protection law in the food and beverage sector. It established strict rules still in effect today. The spirit must be produced at one distillery in one distilling season, aged at least 4 years in a federally bonded warehouse, bottled at exactly 100 proof or 50% ABV, and contain no additives beyond water for proof adjustment. And that's why modern bourbons, like those of Buffalo Trace's E.H. Taylor Jr. line, including the popular bottled in bond expression, honor him by adhering to these exact standards. Many are aged in warehouses he helped build or innovate. In short, Taylor did not draft or write the act as legislation, but his efforts were crucial to its creation and enactment. Well, if you haven't listened to my previous episodes, you might be going, wow, this is becoming pretty convincing, although there are some elements of these stories that are sort of contradicting each other. Well, it gets worse. I decided to ask ChatGPT, who wrote the Bottled in Bond Act? The Bottled in Bond Act was written and introduced by John G. Carlyle, who was serving as the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury at the time. The act was passed by the U.S. Congress and signed into law in 1897 by President William McKinley. Okay, well, I'm sorry, but it was actually Grover Cleveland. I thought that was pretty well known. The law was created to guarantee the quality and authenticity of American whiskey by regulating its production and labeling. So if you've listened to any of my old episodes around the Bottled in Bond Act, you know there is a lot of stuff in here that is just pure bunk. I don't know if there's more lore in any other story than this E.H. Taylor Bottled in Bond Act story. Now, my first two attempts at writing this story, the first one, pure marketing lore, basically. The second attempt, I scratched the record and basically set the record straight as best as I could, but I was somewhat brief in my reply because I didn't want this episode to drag out a long way. Today, I am going to celebrate the Bottled in Bond Act on March 3rd, 2026, by finally taking you through the journey of the development of the Bottled in Bond Act. We're going to challenge the idea of who wrote it, its original purpose, how it became marketing fodder, what the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897 had in it that's different from today's regulations, and we're about to reveal a whole different hero than the one you've always been told about, the real man behind the Bottled in Bond Act. So move over, E.H. Taylor. There's about to be a new sheriff in town. On November 7th, 1895, a Nashville American newspaper headline teased, "Internal Revenue Commissioner's report will contain recommendations of a special interest to the liquor trade." It referenced a message placed in the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue, Joseph S. Miller's annual report that stated, quote, "It is noted that a large proportion of all liquors imported into the United States is in bottles or other small packages, whereas all distilled spirits exported must, in accordance with law, be in the distiller's casks, each of not less than 10 gallons capacity. The attention of this office has repeatedly been called to this discrimination against the products of American distillers, and it has been urged that if spirits were allowed to be bottled in bond, each bottle to have affixed thereto an engraved stamp bearing the signature of the collector, a large export trade would be secured. The cost of preparing and affixing the stamps to be borne by the government has heretofore been an insuperable objection to the adoption of the proposition. This office, however, recommends the passage of an act authorizing the bottling of spirits in bond if the expense of preparing and affixing the stamps is otherwise provided for." Now, if you're saying to yourself, this doesn't sound like a man looking for a consumer protection law, you would be correct. And if you said, where is E.H. Taylor in this message? Well, you've asked a very important question. Now, rather than stringing you along with a mystery, I'm going to come right out and say it. Neither Treasury Secretary John G. Carlisle nor Colonel Edmund H. Taylor had anything to do with proposing a bottling bill. And this idea that it was proposed to save the reputation of Kentucky bourbon from rectifiers, the evidence is going to show that's 100% bunk. Skeptical? Well, let's go back and look at that article where Commissioner Miller's, quote, recommendation will be made with a view of increasing our export trade in bottled goods. The present law requires all whiskey exported in bottles to pay an internal revenue tax of $1.10 per gallon. This, of course, acts as a bar to the exportation of the well-known brands of case goods, unquote. Miller went on to note that, quote, each bottle shall have affixed across the neck an internal revenue stamp of small denomination bearing the signature of the collector, thus giving a guarantee to the purchaser that the whiskey in the bottle was put up under the supervision of the collector and is the genuine article and just what it's represented to be. It is claimed by Internal Revenue officials that such a provision in the law would be a great impetus to our export trade in bottled goods. Its effects would be appreciably felt by the bottling trade, the box makers, the cork dealers, and others, and in a very short while, the United States would command the trade of the world in beverage whiskeys. The proposition to stamp each bottle of whiskey with a government seal meets with the hearty approval of the distillers, and they would not object to paying a small tax sufficient to cover the cost of government inspection. It is the government stamp on bonded Canadian whiskey that gives that article a standing in this country. While the Canadian trade is gradually increasing, owing to our liberal laws, the distillers in this country are practically shut out from exporting their goods to Canada and thus getting a foothold in that market. The Canadians are afraid to compete with American beverage whiskeys, and in order to check the importation of American spirits, the Canadian law requires that all packages exported from the United States to Canada shall be not less than 100 imperial gallons. This law is a hardship on the American distiller who wants to get his goods into Canada, and in order to export whiskey to that country, he must go to the expense of having constructed cases of special sizes for the Canadian trade. And in addition to that, he must get a special permit from the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue to change the packages already in the warehouse from that of American size, 45 gallons, to the Canadian size. The difference between the imperial gallon and the United States gallon is 2 pounds. It is intimated that at the coming session of Congress, the Internal Revenue Bureau will suggest some retaliatory legislation that will cause Canada to treat the American distiller as the United States treats the Canadian distiller. In other words, the American dealer shall have the right to export case goods to Canada, which cannot be done now under existing law. Last year, we imported from Canada 63,969 gallons of Canadian whiskey, the value of which was $121,064. This year, we imported from Canada 138,027 gallons, more than double the amount imported last year. And the value of this year's importation was $261,513, unquote. The article closes by stating, quote, this is of particular importance to the distillers of Tennessee and Kentucky, and if they were to push the matter, there is no question but that Congress would give the distillers the relief asked. Our Canadian cousins may not like the retaliatory legislation, but Canada offers a good market for beverage whiskeys, unquote. So therein lies the perfect argument for a Bottled in Bond Act, all based around one-directional trade that was hurting internal revenue collections thanks to laws that were disadvantaging American distillers. And while the concept of trusted genuine whiskey is mentioned, it's a side benefit, not the purpose of the bill. The absence of rectifiers and adulteration in this article is palpable. So now that the problem has been introduced to the American public, what next? Well, enter a Kentuckian who was ready to take on this challenge full steam. It wasn't Colonel Taylor, and it wasn't John G. Carlisle. Instead, It was a man that time forgot. Joseph S. Miller's predecessor in the job as Internal Revenue Commissioner and the now U.S. Congressman from the 5th District of Kentucky, the Honorable Walter Evans. Born near Glasgow, Kentucky in 1842, Walter Evans attended school in Harrodsburg, Kentucky before moving to Hopkinsville. Beginning his work life as a deputy county clerk, he took up arms for the Union when the Civil War erupted, serving as a lieutenant and attaining the rank of captain. Upon his discharge, he returned to Hopkinsville, became a member of the bar, joined the Republican Party, became a state representative, and then state senator before an unsuccessful run for governor. In May 1883, the great reformer President Chester A. Arthur appointed him as the 10th Commissioner of the Internal Revenue. The newspapers took a confused tone, stating, quote, "He's not the man who it was generally thought would be appointed, and hence there's a great deal of speculation and surprise. Nobody seems to doubt the appointment is a good one, but the truth is, only a few know anything about him," unquote. But those who vouched for him said he was a strong man, and he apparently was personally picked for the job by President Arthur himself, who wanted an independent candidate for the office. The ghosts of patronage and the scandals of President Grant's administration, along with the notorious whiskey ring, still lingered in the air, and Arthur had made a decision to follow in the footsteps of his predecessor, the great reformer President Garfield, in cleaning out the grifters from the federal government. To his own party, Walter Evans was a strong man. To his opponents, he was a machine politician and not to be trusted. But his time in the position of Internal Revenue Commissioner was fairly quiet. After 2 years, he returned to his law practice in Louisville until persuaded to run for Congress, where he took his seat in March of 1895. Now, when Walter got to work on the bottling bill is unknown, but as it turns out, his bill wasn't the first attempt to create a bottling act. That honor goes to Joseph Edwin Washington, a House Democrat from Robertson County in the 6th District of Tennessee. But what Evans created in essence was the same bill. Yet Evans' quick rise up to a position in the House Ways and Means Committee and his relationship with Commissioner Miller would give his bill the inside edge. He also happened to be working on other alcohol-related bills, including one meant to clarify the August 1894 Act, which he hoped to stretch to allow the transfer of bonded spirits between warehouses. With all of this alcohol legislation at his fingertips and his crafting of the bill, when it came time to appoint a subcommittee to review the bill, Evans was appointed as chairman. As expected, on April 28, 1896, the subcommittee reported favorably on the bill, and it was sent to the full committee, where it was also approved. Now it was up to the House of Representatives to debate the bill on the floor. The Louisville Courier noted, quote, "If the bottling bill is passed, it will have an effect to reduce the amount of spirits now held in bond by increasing the export trade of beverage whiskey, placing American distillers on the same footing as the handlers of Canadian club whiskey," unquote. The Detroit Free Press reiterated the reason for the bottling bill. This wasn't any food adulteration bill. Quote, "The real reason for the passage of the bill, known as the Bottling and Bond Bill by the House, is that the Kentucky distillers find something of the sort necessary in order to enable them to compete with Hiram Walker and Sons. At the present time, the only whiskey which comes into the American market in bottles with a government guarantee of purity is Walker's Canadian Club. It has a label pasted over the mouth of the bottle under government supervision stating the age and proof of the liquor. The bottling bill passed by the House will enable the Kentucky distillers to bottle their product after it reaches the age of 4 years under revenue officers' inspection, and when labeled in the way prescribed, will enable dealers to sell bottled goods which will have a reliable guarantee of quality, a thing not now attainable in bottled whiskey. The necessity of the measure to enable Americans to compete with Mr. Walker's wet goods was explained by ex-Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Walter Evans, who is now a member of the House from Louisville. unquote. So from Evans' own mouth, this was all about Canadian Club's export market advantage. When did the discussion of rectifiers and adulteration enter the argument for the bill? Well, the first mention in the press came in May from House Republican David Grant Coulson of the 11th District of Kentucky, who suggested the bill would rid the world of, quote, spurious liquids sold under the name of Kentucky whiskey, unquote. Now, Coulson wasn't a whiskey man. He was just a proud Kentucky lawyer from Pikeville in the eastern mountains of Kentucky. And while his pride in his home spirit was well placed, he would remain a lone voice against fake bourbon for the time being. Well, all eyes turned to the U.S. Senate, where scrutiny would begin in the Finance Committee. There was some doubt as to the passage of the bill on the Senate floor, as Kentucky Senator George Vest was sympathetic to the opposition raised by petitions from Missouri. Well, if a Kentucky senator voted against it, what chance could it reasonably have? To make matters worse, the chairman of the subcommittee reviewing the bill, Rhode Island Republican Senator Nelson Aldrich, delayed the convening of his committee, leading to the belief that he would stall the bill until it was finally killed off at the end of the session. Well, up from Kentucky came State Senator Charles J. Bronston, known as the Red Fox for his flaming red hair and heated temper, and distiller Colonel James E. Pepper, the former ward of Colonel E.H. Taylor. And whether Taylor pushed for this visit by his mentee is unknown, but as the Washington Post reported it, their interest in the bill was, quote, safeguards against spirits in bottles, unquote, and its object, quote, to protect against adulteration, unquote. The Lexington Herald remarked, quote, this bill is of special interest to the distillers of Kentucky as it is to the consumers of bottled beverage whiskey, unquote. Clearly, the discussions in the bluegrass state were ramping up over the adulteration issue by early June. But talk of the bill died out as fall promised to be a hard-fought political campaign for control of Congress and the presidency. One of the biggest issues was gold versus silver and the standard by which America would judge its currency. Well, Evans won re-election, and the country chose to switch back to a Republican president in William McKinley, a fan of tariffs and anything that benefited American business. The larger Kentucky distillers, who were starting to suffer from a market flooded with whiskey, hoped the Evans release valve would solve all of their issues. But as Christmas approached, the distillers got a lump of coal in their stockings from those pesky rectifiers of whiskey. As Senator Aldrich began to move forward with meetings of his subcommittee, the National Wholesaler Liquor Dealers Association lobbied for amendments to the Evans bill. On December 8th, the Committee of Wholesalers met with the Kentucky Distillers Association in Louisville, providing details of their amendments. When the distillers labeled the amendments as ruinous to them, the meeting closed and the liquor dealers headed back east. The liquor dealers were going to take their chances with the Senator's Finance Committee. But the problem was, if the amendments were made, it would have to go back to the House, where passage with those amendments was in doubt. Worse yet, time was running out on the legislative session. It appeared Senator Aldrich was interested in a compromise between the liquor dealers and distillers. After attorneys for the liquor dealers petitioned the committee for a hearing, it was placed on the calendar for January 7th, where both sides could make their cases for and against the amendments. Tennessee Representative Washington, the originator of the original bill, warned, quote, any attempt to encumber the bill with amendments in the Senate would endanger the bill. It is to the interest of the distillers and the consumers of whiskey that the bill pass in its present shape without amendment, unquote. Now, what amendments were being debated was unknown at the time, but the statement by Representative Washington about consumers signaled the liquor dealers were carving out a piece of the pie, and adulteration would go from Kentucky marketing to a life or death situation in regards to the bill. incoming Commissioner Foreman piped up on Christmas Day, revealing his interest in the bill's passage. Quote, in his opinion, the bottling of whiskey in bond will have the tendency to increase our export trade in case goods, and it will also displace Canadian beverage whiskey, which has quite a run in the country simply because it has a stamp of the Canadian government, which is considered by the consumers as a guarantee of purity of the whiskey, unquote. And then he reminded the readers that it would, quote, add to the revenues of the government, unquote. So over 13 months, the Treasury never changed its tune, and in public pronouncements, neither did Walter Evans. This was about the export market and the revenue it could raise. It must be remembered that the Internal Revenue had lost the power to tax individuals several years earlier when the income tax was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. It was whiskey taxes and tariffs that filled the government's coffers. When the 7th arrived, distillers Thomas H. Shirley of Louisville and John B. Thompson of Harrodsburg spoke for the distillers, while Isaac Wolf Bernheim, part owner in the Bernheim Brothers Wholesalers Company, E.L. Snyder, president of the National Wholesaler Distillers Association, and Angelo Meyer of Pennsylvania spoke on behalf of the liquor dealers. Well, the distillers explained that this was all about granting them the privilege of bottling their goods in bond for export under the government guarantee of purity and exempting the goods for exportation from taxation. But Mr. Bernheim had another opinion. Quote, the bill is intended solely to benefit the distillers, principally those of Kentucky. It's a sham, and it's only intended to drive Canadian whiskey out of the market, unquote. He and the others also had to assert that they didn't adulterate their whiskey. Well, Bernheim seemed to be slinging arrows in the fight of his life, yet he was also aware of the mountain he had to climb. In fact, he'd already purchased the property to begin the construction of the Bernheim distillery, now under the control of Heaven Hill, a decision he made after McKinley won the presidency. In his mind, McKinley's win and the firm move towards staying on the gold standard meant any financial risks would be eased in building a distillery. And the writing seemed to be on the wall anyway in terms of rectifying in a bottled and bond world. Well, the most intense moment of the meeting occurred when distiller Shirley suggested a compromise had been reached by opponents of the bill, to which Mr. Snyder wanted to spit nails. But holding his tongue, he just claimed the idea was absurd. After all the bluster, the meeting calmed, and by the end, Bernheim's prophecy seemed to be coming true. The subcommittee ruled favorably, and the full Senate Finance Committee would take up the bill next. Well, weeks passed, and several amendments stayed tacked onto the bill. Colonel Shirley, with his contingency, returned to Washington to fight against any changes. The problem was that any fight against the amendments could drag the bill out. With only 3 weeks left in the legislative session and appropriations bills on the docket, this bill would have to pass through the eye of a needle. Then on January 27th, Kentucky distiller John T. Roach broke the silence as to what the liquor dealers were lobbying for. It appears they wanted to remove the 8-year bonding tax breaks. Instead, they wanted a 1-year maximum bonding period, a play that was 100% to the benefit of the liquor dealers, while forcing distillers to sell off stocks of young whiskey to avoid paying taxes. According to Roach, it was an attempt to take away the distillers' aged whiskey advantage. Not only would the distillers have no intention of doing that, it would run counter to the desires of the Internal Revenue, who were hoping to export a quality product that could compete with Canadian Club. Meanwhile, the incoming McKinley administration, manufacturing interests, and tariff supporters praised the Evans bill as opening up a large export trade not only to Canada, but to Central and South America. Yet Senator Aldrich was not moving quickly on getting the bill attention in the Finance Committee. To this, the Louisville Courier announced, quote, the Aldrich amendments seem to have gotten the bill its death blow, unquote. Yet 2 days later, the Senate Finance Committee finally gave the bill its blessing with the amendments intact. As the bill awaited a floor debate and passage in the Senate, newspapers began touting the aspects of the bill, misrepresenting several items, the biggest of these being the 4-year minimum age claim. The law itself would not create a mandatory age limit of 4 years, and this wouldn't be the only item misinterpreted by current and future advocates of the Bottled in Bond Act. The act did not legislate a specific targeted proof. Instead, it said distillers, quote, may, whenever necessary, reduce such spirits as are withdrawn for bottling purposes by the addition of pure water only to 100% proof for spirits for domestic use, or to not less than 80% proof for spirits for export purposes, unquote. And nowhere does it mandate a bottling proof of exactly 100, but instead it says they, quote, may reduce spirits. What it was doing was establishing permission and a floor, yet reporters and some legislators read it as the product should be bottled at exactly 100 proof. Well, after an entire month of nail-biting by distillers, on February 26th, the Senate finally passed the bottling bill along with its amendments. Now it was back to the House, where an anxious Representative Evans was pacing up and down in front of the Speaker's chair trying to get a vote. Unfortunately, it was held off until the next morning, where once the journal was read, the bill came up for a vote and passed, amendments and all. Well, unfortunately for Evans, it wouldn't happen quite that fast. But on the last day of President Cleveland's administration, March 3rd, 1897, he put pen to paper, and an act to allow the bottling of distilled spirits in bond became the law of the land. So today we tout it as the Bottled in Bond Act of 1897, yet we make an error in placing a date on it. Why? Well, because there are several differences between what is law today and what was in the original act. The original Bottled in Bond Act mandated spirits, not just whiskey, had to come from one distillery from one distilling season, stored in a bonded warehouse under government supervision. No adulteration was allowed, except for the addition of water. A proper tax-paid strip stamp was required, and distillery identification on the label. Now, while it's interesting to note that higher proofs were acceptable, I wasn't able to find any incidents where distillers strayed from 100 proof. Perhaps 100 proof and 4 years were just easier to remember, or simply a gentleman's agreement. As for the modern Bottled in Bond regulations, well, those would be firmed up many years later in 1936, thanks to the Federal Alcohol Administration's standards that locked it in at, quote, at least 4 years aging and 100 proof. The stamp over the bottle would eventually be removed as a regulation. So the regulations evolved, as did the marketing, thanks to a little push from journalists and distillers. George T. Stagg's OFC was one of the early promoters of the bill, touting it as having Uncle Sam's endorsement. Quote, strange as it may seem, very few whiskeys on the market today are able to comply with this law, as few of them possess the qualities of purity and proof requisite. There is, however, one exception, and that is the celebrated OFC whiskey, unquote. He went on to state that, quote, this is the most gratifying thing, as it now definitely defines what is good whiskey and what is bad. Those who are wise will profit by this hint, unquote. There's little doubt that Bernheim's vision of what was to come with the Bottled in Bond bill was dead on. Meanwhile, the Kansas City Times summed it up, saying, quote, the law is a severe blow to the men who make 10-year-old whiskey out of alcohol and a few essences. There is no food product nor any medical article that can thus come directly under the supervision of the government. Consumers should therefore only buy whiskey that is bottled under the government's supervision, and which bears this Internal Revenue stamp as proof of this fact. The stamp is the government's guarantee of the contents of every bottle, both to age and purity. Consumers should buy no other." Unquote. While distillers sought to put the last nail in the coffin of wholesalers, Internal Revenue Commissioner Foreman went right to work on designing stamps and setting up regulations. The Louisville Courier noted, quote, "Commissioner Foreman's mail is very heavy these days with letters from distillers who are asking for information on the subject. Treasury officials say the bottling bill will largely add to the revenues." Unquote. The Lexington Herald announced in a headline, "Bottling Whiskey in Bond, a law that will prove a blessing to the distiller as well as the consumer." It went on to say, quote, "It's impossible to tell how much effect it will have upon the whiskey trade of Kentucky, though it is bound to be the very greatest aid in preventing the adulteration of Kentucky whiskey by the admixture of raw spirits, and its sale as pure old bourbon or Kentucky-made sour mash when the result of the concoction was never inside a Kentucky distillery." Unquote. That opening was followed by a complete reprinting of the Act, word for word, and while the Act talks of bottles, stamps, and exports, it says nothing about adulteration. But apparently, that didn't matter. The marketing had already begun, and the real history of the Bottled in Bond Act and its stated purpose of leveling up competition with Canadian Club and getting into the Canadian market, the primary concern until the 11th hour challenge by liquor wholesalers, was quickly forgotten. And with that, it seems somehow fitting that Colonel E.H. Taylor, a master marketer, ends up getting all the credit for the hard work of one Honorable Walter Evans. I'm Drew Hanisch, and this is Whiskey Lore. Whiskey Lore is a production of Travel Fuels Life, LLC. Production stories and research by Drew Hanisch. Want to read that 1897 bottling bill? Look for episode number 5, season 7 at whiskeyLore.org/episodes. And fans of the Whiskey Flights podcast, well, never fear, more episodes are on the way, but I got to get a little history out of my system. But if you're ready to start planning your summer trips and want to fit in a choice of distillery experiences, make sure you pick up a copy of my new Amazon best-selling book, Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing American Whiskey, with over 1,000 distilleries in the United States listed and plenty of prep material for getting the most out of your distillery visits. It's Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing American Whiskey, available on Amazon by using the shortcut link whiskeyLore.org/American Whiskey. Once again, thanks for growing your whiskey knowledge along with me. I'm your host, Drew Hanisch, and until next time, cheers and slanjava. Find show notes, resources, and transcripts for this episode